November 29, 1986. Davenport, Iowa. Cary Grant collapsed backstage at the Adler Theatre during his one-man show. He was 82 years old. He died that night of a massive stroke. The most elegant man in cinema history died exactly as he lived, performing, maintaining the illusion, hiding who he really was. But here is the truth that Hollywood protected for 50 years. Cary Grant was not who he appeared to be. His name was not even Cary Grant. He was born Archibald Leach in Bristol, England, in 1904, in poverty so complete it shaped everything he became. He learned early that survival required performance. So he created Cary Grant and performed him so brilliantly for 50 years that even he forgot who Archie Leach was. For 50 years, he was the most desired man in Hollywood. But he was never truly happy. He was always performing. And nobody knew the secret that explained why the most desired man seemed so lonely. This is the story of that secret. This is the story of how a boy from Bristol became the most famous movie star in the world by hiding who he really was. If you enjoy deep dives into the hidden lives of old Hollywood legends and the secrets they protected, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these investigations possible. Now let's go back to Bristol, to 1904, to the childhood that made performance the only way to survive. Archibald Alexander Leach was born on January 18, 1904, in Horfield, Bristol, England, to Elias Leach, a garment factory worker who pressed pants for a living, and Elsie Kingdom Leach, a woman who was slowly losing her mind. Bristol in the early 20th century was an industrial city, grey and grim, filled with factories and tenements and the crushing poverty of the working class. The Leach family was not just poor. They were desperately poor. They lived in a two-room apartment with no indoor plumbing, no electricity, no amenities of any kind. Elias earned barely enough to feed the family. Elsie suffered from severe depression and what was likely undiagnosed mental illness, though in 1904 such things were not discussed or treated. They were endured in silence and shame. Archie had one older brother, John, who had died at age 9, before Archie was even born. The death devastated Elsie completely, and she never recovered from it. She became obsessed with John's memory, talking about him constantly, comparing everything and everyone to him, unable to bond with her surviving son because Archie was not John. He was a reminder of what she had lost, not a new beginning but a painful absence. The household was tense, unstable, filled with unspoken grief and resentment. Archie grew up understanding that he was not wanted, that his existence was a disappointment to his mother, that his presence in the house was a reminder of tragedy rather than a source of joy. In 1914, when Archie was 9 years old, he came home from school one day and his mother was gone. His father told him that Elsie had gone to a seaside resort for her health, that she needed rest and fresh air, that she would be back soon. She never came back. For the next 20 years, Archie believed his mother was dead. He carried that belief with him, and it shaped his entire psychology. The fear of abandonment became his defining characteristic. The inability to trust. The belief that people would leave you, that love was not permanent, that the only way to survive was to become someone else, someone that people might want to keep around. But the truth was far darker. Elsie Leach had not died. Elias Leach had committed her to Bristol Lunatic Asylum, a grim Victorian institution where she would remain for over 20 years. He had done this without telling his 9-year-old son the truth. He had lied and said she was dead. And Archie, abandoned by his mother and lied to by his father, grew up alone. Elias was an alcoholic who worked long hours in the garment factory and spent his evenings at the pub, drinking away what little money he made. Archie was left to raise himself, to survive on his own in the streets of Bristol. He wandered the streets, getting into trouble, skipping school, looking for escape from a home that felt like a prison. He found that escape in the theatre. Bristol had several music halls and vaudeville theatres, and young Archie was fascinated by them. He would sneak into theatres through back doors, hide in the balcony, watch the performers from the shadows. Acrobats, singers, comedians, magicians, performers of all kinds who seemed to have discovered something he desperately wanted, the ability to be someone else on stage, to transform yourself, to escape your real life through the power of performance. These performers seemed happy in a way that Archie had never seen anyone be happy. They were loved by the audience. They were applauded. They were desired. And when they left the stage, they could be someone different. They could disappear into the character they had created and leave their real selves behind. Archie understood, even as a young boy, that performance was a form of escape, a way to be someone other than yourself, a way to be loved for who you pretended to be rather than rejected for who you actually were. At age 13, Archie ran away from home and joined a traveling acrobatic troupe called the Bob Pender Stage Troupe. The troupe toured England performing in music halls and vaudeville theatres, and Archie, who was tall and athletic and fearless, became one of their star acrobats. He learned to walk on stilts, to juggle, to do backflips and handsprings, to swing from ropes and perform death-defying acrobatic feats that made audiences gasp and applaud. But more importantly, he learned to perform. He learned that on stage, you could be anyone. You could create a persona, a character, someone who was charming and confident and skilled and worthy of love and applause, even if the real you was terrified and abandoned and poor. On stage, Archie Leach could disappear. In his place stood a performer, someone brave and capable and worthy of applause. The real Archie, the abandoned boy with an alcoholic father and a mother locked in an asylum, did not exist when the lights came up and the music played. Performance was not just entertainment. It was survival. It was the only way to escape who you actually were. In 1920, when Archie was 16 years old, the Bob Pender Stage Troupe was booked to tour the United States. They sailed across the Atlantic to New York and performed in vaudeville theaters across the East Coast. For young Archie, arriving in America was like arriving in a different world. New York was everything Bristol was not: big, loud, rich, full of opportunity, full of people who did not care where you came from or what your accent was or whether your parents were poor or your mother was in an asylum. In New York, nobody knew Archie Leach. Nobody knew his history. Nobody knew about the poverty or the abandonment or the damage. In New York, you could reinvent yourself. You could be anyone you wanted to be. The possibility was intoxicating. In 1922, the Pender Troupe returned to England, but Archie stayed in New York. He was 18 years old, alone in a foreign country, with no money and no prospects, but he had learned to perform, and in the entertainment world of 1920s New York, that was enough. He found work in vaudeville theaters, doing acrobatic acts, small roles in musical comedies, whatever work he could get. He was handsome, 6 feet 1 inch tall with dark hair and striking features. Theater managers noticed him. He was cast in Broadway musicals as a chorus boy, then in small speaking roles. He was not a great singer or dancer, but he had something more valuable: presence. He could walk onto a stage and command attention without saying a word. By the late 1920s, Archie Leach was a working actor in New York, making a decent living, living in a small apartment in Greenwich Village, performing regularly in Broadway productions. But he was becoming increasingly aware that his working-class Bristol accent, his ordinary name, his lack of sophistication would limit his career. If he wanted to be a leading man, if he wanted to play romantic roles opposite the most beautiful actresses in theater and film, he would need to transform himself completely. So he studied. He studied wealthy men, how they dressed, how they spoke, how they carried themselves. He taught himself to speak with a carefully cultivated mid-Atlantic accent, a hybrid of British and American English that sounded sophisticated and vaguely aristocratic, neither fully British nor fully American but something more refined than both. He learned how to wear a suit properly, how to tie a bow tie, how to move with elegance and grace. He observed how wealthy men behaved in social situations, how they made women feel desired, how they commanded respect without appearing aggressive. He was creating a persona, a character, someone who was more sophisticated and more desirable than Archie Leach could ever be. He was creating Cary Grant years before that name even existed. In 1931, Archie was noticed by a talent scout from Paramount Pictures. Hollywood was transitioning to talking pictures, and studios were desperate for actors who could speak well on camera, whose voices would sound good recorded on film. Archie's voice, deep and resonant and elegant with that carefully cultivated mid-Atlantic accent, was perfect. Paramount offered him a contract. $500 per week, an enormous sum during the depths of the Great Depression when many Americans were unemployed and starving. There was one condition. He had to change his name. Archie Leach sounded too ordinary, too working class, not glamorous enough for Hollywood. The studio gave him a list of names to choose from. He selected Cary, possibly after a character he had played in a Broadway show. The studio suggested Grant, which sounded solid, aristocratic, American, strong. On December 7, 1931, Archie Leach signed a contract with Paramount Pictures and officially became Cary Grant. He was 27 years old. He had reinvented himself completely. The poor boy from Bristol, the abandoned child, the vaudeville acrobat, was gone. In his place was Cary Grant, sophisticated, charming, elegant, the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. But it was a performance. And maintaining that performance would require hiding everything about who Archie Leach really was. Cary Grant's first films for Paramount Pictures were forgettable. He was cast in supporting roles, playing handsome but bland leading men in films that nobody remembered. The studio did not know what to do with him. He was too sophisticated for action films, not funny enough for comedies, not intense enough for dramas. He was stuck in limbo, a contract player with potential but no clear path to stardom. But in 1937, everything changed. Director Leo McCarey cast Cary Grant opposite Irene Dunne in a screwball comedy called The Awful Truth. The film was a revelation. Cary Grant was hilarious. He had perfect comic timing, a willingness to look foolish, a charm that made audiences love him even when his character was behaving badly. He could deliver a line with devastating wit and then undercut it with physical comedy, slipping on a rug or falling over furniture, making the elegant Cary Grant look undignified in ways that made audiences roar with laughter. The Awful Truth was a massive hit, and suddenly Cary Grant was a star. Studios competed to cast him. Directors wanted to work with him. Women wanted to be his co-stars and his love interests. Over the next decade, Cary Grant became one of the biggest movie stars in the world. He starred in Bringing Up Baby with Katharine Hepburn, a brilliant screwball comedy where Grant's physical comedy and his chemistry with Hepburn created magic on screen. He starred in Holiday, also with Hepburn, a more serious film about class and marriage and the search for happiness. He appeared in Only Angels Have Wings with Rita Hayworth, playing a tough but charming pilot. He appeared in His Girl Friday, a rapid-fire comedy where he played a manipulative newspaper editor trying to keep his ex-wife from remarrying. He starred in The Philadelphia Story with Hepburn and James Stewart, a romantic comedy so perfect, so beautifully constructed, that it remains one of the greatest films ever made. He worked with director Alfred Hitchcock on Suspicion, a psychological thriller where Grant played a man his wife suspects of being a murderer. He appeared in Arsenic and Old Lace, a dark comedy where he played a man surrounded by murderous relatives. He worked with Hitchcock again on Notorious, playing a secret agent who falls in love with a woman assigned to seduce a Nazi spy. The film is a masterpiece, combining espionage, romance, psychological complexity, and visual brilliance in ways that influenced generations of filmmakers. By the 1940s, Cary Grant was not just a star. He was a phenomenon. He was nominated for Academy Awards. He was the highest-paid actor in Hollywood. He was elegant, sophisticated, funny, romantic, and seemingly perfect. He was the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. But his personal life was chaos. Cary Grant was married 5 times, and none of the marriages were happy. His first marriage, in 1934, was to actress Virginia Cherrill, best known for playing the blind girl in Charlie Chaplin's City Lights. The marriage lasted 1 year before ending in divorce. His second marriage, in 1942, was to heiress Barbara Hutton, one of the richest women in America, heiress to the Woolworth fortune. The press called them Cash and Cary, insinuating that Grant had married her for money. The marriage was miserable and lasted 3 years. His third marriage, in 1949, was to actress Betsy Drake, an intelligent and unconventional woman interested in psychology and therapy. This marriage lasted 13 years, longer than any of his others, but it was not happy. His fourth marriage, in 1965, was to actress Diane Cannon, 33 years younger than him. They had one daughter, Jennifer, but the marriage was troubled and ended in a bitter divorce after 2 years. His fifth marriage, in 1981, was to Barbara Harris, a public relations executive 4 to 7 years younger than him. This marriage lasted until his death in 1986. 5 marriages. None of them happy. all of them seemingly driven by a desperate need to prove something, to project an image of heterosexual normalcy, to maintain the performance of Cary Grant. Because throughout his entire career, there were rumors. Persistent, consistent rumors that Cary Grant was not interested in women. That his real relationships were with men. That the marriages were performances, publicity stunts designed to protect his career and his carefully constructed image. The most significant relationship in Cary Grant's life was not with any of his 5 wives. It was with Randolph Scott, a Hollywood actor who appeared in westerns and action films and became one of Grant's closest companions and, according to the evidence, his most important love. Cary Grant and Randolph Scott met in 1932, shortly after Grant arrived in Hollywood. They became inseparable. They spent time together constantly, going to restaurants and clubs, attending parties, being seen around Hollywood together in a way that suggested deep emotional connection. In 1933, they moved in together, sharing a beach house in Malibu that they called Bachelor Hall. They lived together, on and off, for over 12 years, from 1933 to 1945. During this period, both men were married to women, but they always returned to living together between marriages, or in some cases, during marriages when their wives were away. Paramount Pictures' publicity department promoted the living arrangement as a charming example of male friendship, 2 bachelors sharing expenses during the Great Depression, a wholesome story of economic cooperation and companionship. They arranged photo shoots of Cary and Randy, as they called each other, lounging by the pool at Bachelor Hall, cooking together in the kitchen, playing tennis, doing domestic tasks together. The photos were published in fan magazines with captions about their close friendship. But the photos were also remarkably intimate in ways unusual for the era. In many of them, Cary and Randy are shirtless, relaxed, comfortable with physical closeness. They are laughing together, touching each other casually, looking at each other with affection. They are comfortable in each other's presence in a way that suggested deep emotional and physical connection. To modern eyes, the photos look exactly like pictures of a couple. In one famous photo, Cary is wearing an apron and holding a frying pan, while Randy sits at the breakfast table reading the newspaper. Both men are barefoot and casual, relaxed in a domestic scene that looks exactly like a photograph of a married couple. In another photo, both men are shirtless, lying on deck chairs by the pool, their bodies nearly touching. They are smiling at each other, not at the camera. The body language is intimate and undeniable. But in the 1930s and 40s, homosexuality was illegal in California. The Hollywood Production Code explicitly forbade any depiction of homosexuality in films. Actors who were discovered to be gay were blacklisted and their careers destroyed. Studios went to great lengths to hide the sexuality of gay actors, arranging marriages to women, creating fake romances, threatening journalists who tried to report rumors. Cary Grant and Randolph Scott were protected by Paramount's publicity machine. The studio promoted their living arrangement as friendship, and the public accepted it. But within Hollywood, everyone knew. Actors, directors, studio executives, gossip columnists, they all knew that Cary and Randy were a couple. But nobody said it publicly because the studio would destroy anyone who did. Cary Grant was too valuable to Paramount. He was making millions of dollars for the studio. He was one of the biggest stars in the world. If the public learned he was gay, his career would end, Paramount would lose millions, and the carefully constructed fantasy of Hollywood glamour would be shattered. So the secret was protected. When Cary married Virginia Cherrill in 1934, Randolph Scott served as best man at the wedding. When the marriage ended less than a year later, Cary moved back in with Randy. Randolph Scott married an heiress in 1936, but the marriage ended quickly, and Randy moved back in with Cary. This pattern continued for over a decade. Both men would marry women, the marriages would fail, and they would return to living together. In 1942, Cary married Barbara Hutton, one of the richest women in America. The press called it a fairy tale romance. The reality was that Barbara Hutton was desperately unhappy, addicted to pills and alcohol, and Cary Grant was rarely home. He spent most of his time with Randolph Scott. The marriage ended in 1945. That same year, Randolph Scott married Patricia Stillman, and this marriage lasted. Scott moved out of the Malibu beach house permanently. Cary Grant was devastated. Friends later said that the end of his relationship with Randolph Scott was the most painful event of his life, more painful than any of his divorces, more painful even than discovering his mother was alive after believing she was dead for 20 years. Because Randolph Scott was the only person Cary Grant had ever truly loved. He was the only person Cary could be himself around, the only person before whom the performance of Cary Grant could drop away and Archie Leach could exist. When Randy married Patricia and moved away permanently, Cary lost not just a lover but his only refuge from the performance that had consumed his entire life. In 1949, 5 years after losing Randolph Scott, Cary Grant married actress Betsy Drake. This marriage was different from his previous ones. Betsy Drake was intelligent, educated, unconventional, interested in psychology and the emerging field of psychotherapy. She was interested in understanding human behavior, in exploring the mind, in delving into the psychological roots of why people did what they did. She encouraged Cary to explore his own psychology, to confront the trauma of his childhood, to deal with the abandonment by his mother and the lies his father had told him, to understand the psychological damage that had shaped his entire life. Betsy introduced Cary to Dr. Mortimer Hartman, a Beverly Hills psychiatrist who was conducting experimental LSD therapy sessions with select patients. This was in the early 1950s, before LSD was made illegal, when it was being used experimentally in psychiatric practice to treat depression, anxiety, trauma, and other psychological conditions. Cary Grant began LSD therapy in 1956 and participated in over 100 sessions between 1956 and 1962. He later said that LSD had saved his life, that it had allowed him to confront the pain of his childhood, to understand why he had spent his entire life performing, to accept parts of himself he had been hiding. What parts? He never said explicitly, never named them directly in any public statement. But people who knew him, who understood the trajectory of his life, believed that LSD therapy allowed Cary Grant to accept his sexuality, to stop seeing it as something shameful that needed to be hidden, to understand that the performance of Cary Grant, the heterosexual leading man, was destroying Archie Leach, the real person underneath. The LSD sessions were intense. Under the influence of the drug, Cary's psychological defenses dissolved. He confronted memories he had repressed for decades. He wept as he remembered his mother abandoning him, remembered believing she was dead, remembered the loneliness and the fear. He remembered his father's drunkenness and coldness. He remembered the shame of being poor, of having an accent that marked him as working class, of being unlovable. He understood, perhaps for the first time, the cost of creating Cary Grant as an escape from Archie Leach. In 1959, when Cary was 55 years old, something extraordinary happened. His mother, Elsie Leach, whom he had believed dead since age 9, was alive. She was 78 years old and had been living in a care facility in Bristol for over 40 years. Cary's father had committed her to Bristol Lunatic Asylum in 1914 and had never told Archie the truth. Cary flew to England and met his mother for the first time in over 40 years. The reunion was emotional and complicated. Elsie was elderly and institutionalized, her mind damaged by decades in the asylum. She barely recognized him. She knew she had a son named Archie, but she did not connect this elegant, famous American movie star with the 9-year-old boy she had last seen in 1914. Cary arranged for Elsie to be moved to a better care facility and supported her financially for the rest of her life. She died in 1973 at age 92. Cary never spoke publicly about the reunion or about the trauma of discovering his mother was alive. But friends said that the discovery devastated him, that it confirmed his deepest fears about abandonment and betrayal. The LSD therapy allowed Cary to process this trauma, but it also allowed him to confront other hidden parts of himself. People who knew him during this period said that LSD changed him, that he became more open, more willing to acknowledge that the persona of Cary Grant was a performance. In interviews during the 1960s, Cary began making cryptic comments about identity. He told one interviewer, "I pretended to be somebody I wanted to be and I finally became that person." Or he became me. Or we met at some point. He told another interviewer, "Everyone wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant." These comments suggest that Cary was struggling with the disconnect between Archie Leach and Cary Grant, between who he really was and who he had been performing for decades. In 1965, at age 61, Cary Grant married Diane Cannon, an actress 33 years younger than him. The marriage was a mistake from the beginning. Diane later said in interviews that Cary was controlling and emotionally distant, that he pushed her to participate in LSD therapy which terrified her, that he had mood swings and emotional instability caused by his excessive use of LSD, that he was verbally and possibly physically abusive. They had one daughter, Jennifer, born in 1966. The marriage was violent and unhappy. By 1968, only 3 years after they married, Diane filed for divorce. During the divorce proceedings, she testified in court that Cary Grant had used LSD excessively, that he had psychological issues related to his childhood, that he was emotionally unstable and sometimes abusive. The testimony was reported in newspapers across the country, and suddenly Cary Grant, the elegant, sophisticated leading man, was being described as a drug user and an emotionally unstable man capable of abuse. The image of Cary Grant, so carefully maintained for decades, was damaged. Cary Grant had retired from acting in 1966, after filming Walk, Don't Run, his 72nd film. He was 62 years old and had decided he was too old to play romantic leading men. He stepped away from Hollywood and spent the 1970s living quietly, serving on the board of directors for several companies, traveling, spending time with his daughter Jennifer when she would see him, trying to piece together some kind of life outside of the performance that had consumed the previous 50 years. But retirement did not bring peace. The divorce from Diane Cannon was bitter and public. He was estranged from his daughter Jennifer for years because of the conflict between her parents. He lived alone in a large house in Beverly Hills, wealthy and famous but profoundly lonely. He had no significant relationships. He had no close friends he could be himself around. The loss of Randolph Scott had left him without a refuge, without a place where the performance could end. He was still Cary Grant, still performing, still hiding. In the late 1970s, Cary Grant began doing something unexpected. He started touring the country performing one-man shows titled A Conversation with Cary Grant. These were not performances in the traditional sense, not acting in scripted plays. They were question-and-answer sessions where Cary would sit on stage and answer questions from the audience about his career, his films, his co-stars. He would tell stories about working with Alfred Hitchcock, about kissing Ingrid Bergman and Grace Kelly, about Katharine Hepburn's sense of humor. He was charming, funny, articulate, and audiences loved him. The shows sold out wherever he performed. And Cary Grant, at 70 and then 80 years old, still performed the role brilliantly. He was still elegant, still sophisticated, still the perfect gentleman. But now, with age and distance from Hollywood, he would occasionally let the mask slip. He would make comments about how lonely fame was, about how he had never been comfortable being Cary Grant, about how the person on screen was not the person he really was. In interviews during this period, Cary Grant said things that hinted at the truth beneath the performance. He said, "Everyone wants to be Cary Grant, even I want to be Cary Grant." He said the person the public knew as Cary Grant was a creation, a performance, not a real person. These comments were published in magazines and newspapers, but the journalists did not push further. Perhaps they understood the nature of the secret and chose to protect it, as Hollywood had protected it for 50 years. In 1981, at age 77, Cary Grant married for the 5th time. His bride was Barbara Harris, a public relations executive and former model, 30 to 47 years younger than him depending on which source you believe. The marriage seemed absurd to many people. A 77-year-old man marrying a woman in her 30s. But those who knew Cary understood that this marriage was different from all the others. Barbara Harris was not impressed by Cary Grant the movie star. She had not grown up watching his films. She did not idolize him. She married him because she understood that Cary Grant was a performance and that underneath the performance was a damaged, complicated, lonely man who needed love and acceptance. Barbara allowed Cary to be Archie Leach. She did not expect him to be Cary Grant. She did not demand that he perform. For the first time in his life, Cary did not have to perform at home. He could be himself. He could be vulnerable. He could be honest. The marriage worked in a way that his previous 4 marriages never had. Cary seemed genuinely happy for the first time in decades. He stopped performing A Conversation with Cary Grant shows. He focused on his family. He was close to his daughter Jennifer. He seemed, finally, to have found peace. But even in this final marriage, Cary never spoke openly about his sexuality. If he confided in Barbara about his feelings for Randolph Scott, about his true identity beneath the Cary Grant persona, Barbara has never spoken about it publicly. She has protected his privacy even after his death, maintaining the mystery that Cary himself maintained for his entire life. In his final years, married to Barbara, in the quiet moments of an 80-year-old man at the end of his life, the distinction between Cary Grant and Archie Leach had finally blurred. Perhaps they had become one person, no longer in conflict with each other but merged into something whole. Perhaps Cary had finally become Archie, or Archie had finally become Cary, or they had met somewhere in between and made peace. But then, in November 1986, Cary Grant agreed to do one more A Conversation with Cary Grant show. The event was booked at the Adler Theatre in Davenport, Iowa, a small Midwestern city far from Hollywood. Cary was 82 years old. His health was declining. His doctor had advised him to stop traveling, to cancel the tour. But Cary insisted. He wanted to perform one more time. Perhaps he needed to. Perhaps, after spending his entire life hiding who he really was, he needed to perform, needed to be Cary Grant one more time before Cary Grant disappeared forever. On November 29, 1986, Cary Grant walked onto the stage at the Adler Theatre in Davenport, Iowa. The theatre was sold out. Over 2,000 people had come to see him. He looked elegant even at 82. He was wearing a tuxedo, impeccably tailored, perfectly pressed. He sat down on the stage and began answering questions for 90 minutes. He told stories about Hitchcock. He talked about Grace Kelly and Ingrid Bergman. He discussed Katharine Hepburn's competitiveness and her sense of humor. He made jokes about his 5 marriages. The audience loved him. They gave him standing ovations. Even at 82, Cary Grant was still performing brilliantly. He was still charming, still witty, still elegant. He was still giving the audience what they wanted. During intermission, after 90 minutes on stage, Cary went backstage. His assistant was waiting for him. Cary was sweating profusely. His face was pale. He was struggling to breathe. His assistant asked if he wanted to cancel the second half. Cary refused. He said he was fine, that he just needed a moment to rest. He was not fine. But Cary Grant had spent his entire life doing what he had to do, pushing through pain, maintaining the performance no matter the cost. He was not going to stop now. He was not going to disappoint the audience. He was not going to admit that he was weak, that he was failing, that the performance was becoming too much. At 11:22 p.m., while sitting in his dressing room backstage, about to return to the stage, Cary Grant suffered a massive stroke. He collapsed. An ambulance was called. He was rushed to St. Luke's Hospital in Davenport. Doctors tried to stabilize him, but the stroke had been catastrophic. The damage to his brain was too extensive. There was nothing they could do. At 11:22 p.m., Cary Grant was pronounced dead. He was 82 years old. He had died in Davenport, Iowa, a small Midwestern city far from Hollywood, far from the glamour and the fame, far from the life he had built as Cary Grant. But in a way, it was a fitting place to die. He died performing. He died being Cary Grant. He died on a stage, under the lights, doing what he had done his entire life, maintaining the performance, giving the audience what they wanted, hiding who he really was. He died as Cary Grant. Archie Leach remained hidden, even in death. The news reached Hollywood the next morning. Tributes poured in from around the world. Frank Sinatra said Hollywood had lost its king. Gregory Peck called him the greatest leading man in cinema history. Katharine Hepburn said he was the most talented actor she had ever worked with. President Ronald Reagan, himself a former actor, sent condolences. Queen Elizabeth II sent a message of sympathy. Newspapers published lengthy obituaries celebrating his career, his 72 films, his elegance, his charm, his sophistication, his iconic roles, his influence on cinema. But the obituaries did not mention Randolph Scott. They did not mention the 12 years Cary Grant had lived with another man. They did not mention the rumors that had followed him his entire career. They did not mention the possibility that the most desired heterosexual leading man in Hollywood history might not have been heterosexual at all. The secret was protected even in death. Hollywood, the studio system, the gossip columnists, the media, all of them continued to protect the secret, just as they had protected it for 50 years. The official narrative remained unchanged. Cary Grant was a great actor, a sophisticated gentleman, a man who had been married 5 times, a legend of Hollywood's golden age. The truth remained hidden. Cary Grant's funeral was held on December 4, 1986, in Davenport, Iowa. It was a small, private ceremony attended by his widow Barbara Harris, his daughter Jennifer, and a handful of close friends. There was no Hollywood memorial service. No public event where stars could pay tribute. Cary had specifically requested that his funeral be private. For the first time in his life, there was no performance. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California, disappearing into the water as completely as Archie Leach had disappeared into Cary Grant all those years ago. There is no grave, no physical memorial, no place where fans can visit. Cary Grant simply disappeared, leaving behind 72 films and a mystery. In the years following his death, the truth about Cary Grant began to emerge slowly, piece by piece. In 1999, Scotty Bowers, a former male prostitute who had operated in Hollywood during the 1940s and 50s, published a memoir titled Full Service. The book described Bowers' business arranging sexual encounters for Hollywood stars who were gay or bisexual but could not risk being discovered. Bowers claimed that Cary Grant had been one of his clients, that he had arranged multiple encounters between Cary and young men, that everyone in Hollywood knew Cary was gay. The book was controversial. Some dismissed it as sensationalism, lies designed to sell copies. Others, particularly people who had known Cary Grant personally, said that Bowers was telling the truth, that Cary had indeed been gay or bisexual, that his marriages to women had been covers, that his relationship with Randolph Scott had been romantic. In 2004, William J. Mann published a biography titled Behind the Screen: How Gays and Lesbians Shaped Hollywood. The book included extensive documentation of Cary Grant's relationship with Randolph Scott, analyzing the photographs of them together, the living arrangements, the timeline of their cohabitation interrupted by marriages to women. Mann argued that Cary Grant and Randolph Scott were a couple, that their relationship was one of the longest and most significant romantic relationships in Hollywood history, and that the studio system had protected them by framing their relationship as friendship. Other biographers have been more cautious. Some acknowledge the rumors but note that Cary himself never publicly identified as gay and that speculation is ethically complicated. Others describe Cary as bisexual, attracted to both men and women but more comfortable with men emotionally and physically. The truth is that we will never know for certain. Cary Grant never came out publicly. He never acknowledged being gay or bisexual in any public statement. He maintained the performance of Cary Grant, heterosexual leading man, until his death. He died with the secret. But the evidence is compelling. The 12 years living with Randolph Scott in a house they called Bachelor Hall. The intimate photographs of them together, shirtless, comfortable, casual in ways that suggested deep emotional and physical connection. The pattern of his marriages, all 5 of them to women, all 5 of them ending in failure or unhappiness. The comments about being lonely, about pretending, about not knowing who he really was. The LSD therapy designed to allow him to confront hidden parts of himself. The testimony from people like Scotty Bowers who claimed to have first-hand knowledge. All of this suggests a man who was hiding something fundamental about himself, who spent his entire life performing a role, who created the persona of Cary Grant specifically to protect Archie Leach from a world that would have destroyed him if it knew the truth. What makes Cary Grant's story particularly tragic is not just that he had to hide who he was, but that he was so extraordinarily good at hiding it. Cary Grant was not just a movie star. He was the embodiment of masculinity for an entire generation. He was the man other men wanted to be. Elegant, sophisticated, confident, desired by beautiful women. The idea that this icon of heterosexual masculinity might have been gay challenges fundamental assumptions about gender, sexuality, and masculinity itself. It forces us to ask, if Cary Grant, the most masculine man in Hollywood, was gay, what does masculinity even mean? The answer is uncomfortable. Masculinity, like everything else about Cary Grant, was a performance. It was a construction, a carefully crafted persona designed to appeal to audiences and hide the truth. Real identity has nothing to do with appearance or costume or the ability to perform a role convincingly. It has to do with authenticity, with being true to yourself, with the courage to be yourself even when the world demands that you be someone else. Cary Grant did not have that courage. He could not have had that courage in the 1930s and 40s when homosexuality was illegal and careers were destroyed by scandal. But by the 1970s and 80s, when attitudes had shifted, when other actors were coming out, when the world was changing, Cary Grant still could not come out. He was too invested in the performance. He had been Cary Grant for so long that Archie Leach no longer existed as a separate entity. They had merged completely. To come out would have been to admit that everything he had built was a lie. It would have meant destroying the legend that had taken him 50 years to construct. He was not willing to do that. In 1958, Cary Grant gave an interview to Ladies' Home Journal. He said, "I have spent the greater part of my life fluctuating between Archie Leach and Cary Grant, unsure of either, suspecting each." This quote is perhaps the most honest thing Cary Grant ever said publicly. It reveals the fundamental tragedy of his life. He had created Cary Grant to escape Archie Leach, but in doing so, he had lost himself. He was not Archie anymore, but he was not really Cary either. He was trapped between two personas, unable to be fully either one, living a life of performance that never ended. The question that haunts Cary Grant's story is, what if he had been born in a different era? What if he had lived in a time when being gay was not illegal, when Hollywood did not destroy gay actors, when he could have lived openly with Randolph Scott without fear of career destruction? Would he have been happier? Would he have avoided the 5 failed marriages, the loneliness, the decades of performance? We will never know. Cary Grant made sure of that. He protected the secret until the very end. Today, more than 35 years after his death, Cary Grant is still one of the most famous actors in the world. His films are shown on television constantly. His image is used in advertising, in other films, in popular culture. He is referenced in songs and books and documentaries as the epitome of masculine elegance, the standard against which other leading men are measured. But we still do not really know who he was. We know Cary Grant, the persona, the performance, the construction. We do not know Archie Leach, the person underneath. We do not know the boy from Bristol who was abandoned by his mother and lied to by his father. We do not know the man who lived with another man for 12 years. We do not know the man who took LSD over 100 times trying to understand himself. We do not know the man who said he was unsure of both Archie Leach and Cary Grant, suspecting each, unable to be either one fully. And maybe that is how Cary wanted it. Maybe he spent his entire life constructing Cary Grant specifically so that Archie Leach could remain hidden, protected, safe from the world that had abandoned him when he was 9 years old. Maybe the performance was not a burden but a necessity, a defense mechanism, a survival strategy. Maybe Cary Grant was the greatest act of love Archie Leach could give himself, the gift of being someone else, someone wanted, someone loved, someone admirable. But the cost was that Archie Leach never got to live. He was buried under Cary Grant for 50 years. He was hidden so completely that when Cary Grant died in 1986, Archie died with him, having never been fully known, fully seen, fully himself. The legacy of Cary Grant is complicated. He made 72 films, many of them masterpieces. Bringing Up Baby, The Philadelphia Story, Notorious, North by Northwest, Holiday, His Girl Friday, and dozens more. These are brilliant examples of cinema at its best. He defined elegance and sophistication for the 20th century. He was nominated for 2 Academy Awards and received an honorary Oscar in 1970. He is consistently ranked as one of the greatest actors in cinema history. But he also lived a lie for over 50 years. He married women he did not love to protect his career. He hid his true self so thoroughly that even his closest friends were not sure who he really was. He died having never been able to live openly as the person he actually was. On November 29, 1986, Cary Grant walked onto a stage in Davenport, Iowa, and performed Cary Grant one last time. He told charming stories. He made self-deprecating jokes. He answered questions about working with Hitchcock and kissing Ingrid Bergman. The audience loved him. They gave him standing ovations. And then he went backstage and died. It was a fitting end. Cary Grant died performing. He died being Cary Grant one last time. He died on a stage, under the lights, doing what he had done his entire life, giving the audience what they wanted, maintaining the illusion, hiding who he really was. This is the story of Cary Grant. This is the story of Archie Leach. This is the story of a boy who learned to perform to survive, who performed so brilliantly that he became the most famous actor in the world, who spent his entire life hiding who he really was and died without ever being fully known. This is the story of the double life of Cary Grant, and the secret that died with him.